Hey guys, welcome to the channel. My name is Mr. C. Like, subscribe, and comment if you have any question, and let's get into it. This lecture is on motor development and learning, Chapter 1, Fundamental Concept. Throughout this chapter, we will see a lot of terminology. Essentially, this chapter is mostly about defining terms about motor development before we dive into later chapters about motor development. It's important to first understand the terms and understand what motor development is. So let's get started. Development is a continuous process of change and functional capacity. It is related but not dependent on age. It involves sequential changes. So what does it mean that it is related to age? When we talk about development and age and how it relates to age, is that yes, development does occur with age. So meaning that a baby over time will develop from the time they are 0 months to 2 months. There is some sort of development happening which is related to the fact that they are growing older, but it does not depend on the age, meaning that a person could be a certain age, but the amount of development that happens may not be the same for somebody else. And the second thing is that it is sequential change, meaning that development happens step by step. Let's move on. Motor development, a continuous age-related process of change in movement, as well as the interacting constraint in the individual environment and tasks that drive these changes. To break down this definition, the word motor itself means movement, and development, as we learned before, is a continuous change, age-related process of change, and therefore motor development is movement changes. So changes in movement. And in this definition, we also encounter a new word, which is constraint. And later in this chapter, we'll learn what does the word constraint is and how does it affect movement changes, and whether in the environment, and what are the different type of constraints that are present, and which can also have an influence on how a person change. So later on in this chapter, we will see different constraints and how they affect movement changes. Next is motor learning. And motor learning is the relative permanent gain in motor skills, capability associated with practice and experience. And simply put, to break down this definition, as we learned previously, motor means movement, and learning is the process of learning something new. And as the definition states, is learning and gaining like a permanent skill, motor skill and capability, which is associated with practice and experience. For example, walking is a gain motor skills that we obtain as a result of practice and experience. As babies, we experience walking, and we practice until a point where we got to a point where we're able to walk without even thinking about it. Next term is motor control. And motor control is the study of neural, physical, and behavioral aspect of movement. So this is essentially referring to what controls movement. How does movement happen? And an example is This is referring to the nervous system controls of muscle that permits skilled and coordinate movement. So the nervous system, which is the central nervous system, the control center of our body, which allowed muscles to contract and permits skilled and coordinate movement such as walking. And the next slide, motor behavior. It is the connection between motor control and motor learning. Essentially, the term motor behavior is used for when you do not want to be specific to which you want to refer to in terms of motor control and motor learning. So you use motor behavior to refer to both of them. So meaning you're talking, once you say motor behavior, you're talking about both motor control and motor learning. The next slide is physical growth, which is an increase in size or body mass resulting from an increase in complete already formed body parts. Essentially, physical growth, which is straightforward, is increase in size or body mass, as it states. And for human, this growth period starts with conception and ends in late adolescence or the early 20s. Next, aging, the process occurring with the passage of time that leads to loss of adaptability or full function and eventually to death. Aging is growing older and with the passage of time, meaning age, and that leads to loss of adaptabilities. For example, loss of bone density and many other functions that used to be easy at a certain time in the lifespan, and which is as you grow older you lose some steps, and eventually aging leads to death, unfortunately. And our next slide is constraints. And I know it's not on the slide, but constraint is some sort of limitation or restriction. In this case, the characteristics of individual, environment, or task that encourage some movement while discouraging other. So essentially, it is saying that we have different type of constraints, such as individual, environmental, or task constraints that allowed certain movements, allowed a person to move certain ways, but it is also discouraging certain movement and not allowing certain movement to happen. And throughout the rest of the chapter, we will see some terms and definition of each and different types of constraints that are available, such as individual, environmental, and task constraints. So first we have individual constraints, which is a person unique physical and mental characteristics. Within the individual constraints, we also have two type of individual constraints. First is structural, which is related to the body structure. For example, how high a person is, the weight, the muscle mass, and leg length, and all these things could be constraints because, for example, in basketball, if I'm a certain height, I might have a certain advantage versus if I were a little shorter. And this is a structural constraint which is related to physical, such as body parts. And the next type of individual constraint are functional, which is related to behavioral functions such as motivation, fear experiences, and attentional focus. And those types of individual constraint are internal versus structural, which is external, which has to do with the physical part of our body. And the next type of constraint is environmental constraint. And they are constraints related to the world around us. For example, temperature, amount of light, humidity, and gravity. And they can play a big role on how we move. For example, in any sport, imagine without basketball, a previous example, imagine playing basketball on a grass surface versus a wood or concrete surface. The way the ball bounce would be very different, and it would be abnormal, which would change the way you would play basketball and completely change the game. So that does change the way we do certain things, we do certain movements. And temperature, imagine playing football in a hot weather outside. It would you would be more dehydrated, so therefore you would move slower. And imagine the amount of light, the humidity and gravity. They can all have effect on how we move and how we do certain things and how we play certain sports. Next is task constraint, and they include goals and rules, structures of particular movement or gravity. And for example, in soccer, the goal is to score the ball in the goal. And the rule require you not to use your hand. So the task is to score the goal and not you without using your hand. So that is a task, and to achieve that goal, you have to move a certain way. When you pass the ball, you have to dribble the ball to get there. You have to dribble the ball to pass it to the defender. You have to dribble the ball to get around your defender. So you change the way you move is different, and in order to achieve that goal, which is to score. And it is important to know that is external to the body. They include the rules that surround a movement or activity. Next slide. The Newell's model of constraint. And in motor development, we use the Newell's model of development, which is essentially a theory of motor development that emphasizes the influence of individual, environment, and task constraints. So it's essentially saying that the interaction of individual task and environment changes movement over time. Pattern of interaction lead to changes in motor development. Newell model guide us in identifying developmental factors affecting movement. They also help us create developmentally appropriate tasks and environments, and help us understand individual movers or players in sport as different from group norms or average. And the next term is longitudinal research study. It is a study in which the same individual or group observe performing the same task or behavior on numerous occasions over a long time. It is simply put a research where you're observing the same person and doing the same thing over a period of time. And the next research study is cross-sectional. It is a study in which developmental change is inferred by observing individual or groups of varying ages at this one point in time. You're just observing changes in groups at different ages at one point of time. So, for example, you might observe change in adolescence. So, if you're observing change in adolescence, you might measure a group of kids at different age, for example, 13, 15, and 17 years old, and you get your data. And the next term is cohort, which is a group whose members share a common characteristics such as age and experience. It's basically a group that have the same thing in common, a group that you're testing which have the same thing in common as mentioned, age or experience. And last but not least, the last term is mixed longitudinal slash sequential study, and it is a study of several age group that are observed at one time over a short time span, permitting observation of an age span that is longer than observational period. So this study is used to cut down on the amount of time that you have to spend doing a certain study. So instead of studying each age group separately over a long period of time, and what you could do and what is the definition essentially saying is you observe several groups at one time over a short time, which cut down on the amount of time that you would have to wait to get your data. So that's it. And as always, guys, thank you for watching and thank you for your patience, and I hope that you like this lecture. And so comment, subscribe, and leave some thumbs up, and let me know if you have any question in the comment section, and so I can help you guys out. So thank you for watching.